Welcome to Artistic Adventures. We're up to episode 5. We're making this guy Baby Yoda. And although this video is not very how to make Baby Yoda, it's more about how to fix Baby Yoda. It's kind of a nightmare, as you can see here. I told you I dropped him, broke off his head, broke his arm, his hands came off the wire, this hip cracked, and a toe came off. So there's lots of things here to fix, and I decided to show this because I thought, hey, it might help somebody else who has a disaster like I did. So I'm here to make the disasters for you. So some of the pieces, like this foot, was actually easy to put back together because it broke very cleanly, and I could just use some super glue. And the main thing I really wanted to do here was make sure that I didn't squeeze the super glue out between the cracks, because that would leave a ridge. We're trying to make a mold out of this, so I don't want to do that. Although, you could sand it off, but it's easier if we just try to contain the super glue in the cracked area, and that worked really well for that piece. That was easy. I wish all the pieces were that easy. Unfortunately, like with the arms and the legs, because of the armature with the aluminum foil, it was just impossible to squeeze the two pieces together like that toe. You just put it together and it sticks. With them, the armature is kind of pushing it out all the time, and there's no way you can stand there and hold it and make it stick. So what I decided to do was, this is a technique where you make some sort of sand-like particles out of some baked polymer clay and mix it with epoxy resin to make a paste. So I'm just scraping that off the table where I've grated it on my kitchen grater on the very finest grating, and then you mix it with the epoxy to make the paste, sort of like a putty, and put it in the cracks. Now later on I'll show you a better way to do it than using the kitchen grater. For this toe here that broke off, I was not able to find all the pieces to be able to just glue it back on. So what I'm going to do is actually make a whole nother toe out of polymer clay, bake it, and then glue it on. So I think I can do that by pressing the clay into the broken area to make it the same shape, so that when we bake it, we can just glue it right into that shape. So basically just putting a new toenail, and that toenail right there ended up being a big problem for me when I was doing the mold, because it's sticking up too far. Also, the toenails, kind of come to a little tiny point, which was not good. So one of the things I think I would suggest is to not do the toenails on the mold. But there's the piece that I molded. You can see how it looks, and then we're going to bake it. And we come back, and that's how it looks. So now, if all goes well, we can just super glue that on, and won't be too big of a gap. If there is always some shrinkage when you bake clay. It's not hugely noticeable, but even so, I think we can use some of that putty that I'm talking about to fill in any gaps. But we can get it closely back to where it was before it broke off. But like I was saying, with the toenails, they caused a lot of issues with the mold process because they're so small. It was hard to get them out. And I think what I would do is just do toes and then come back later after you molded the piece and put a molded toenail on top of sort of a nail bed, so to speak. I think that would make it a whole lot easier to get it out of the mold. So this worked pretty well. That fit on almost perfectly. There was a little tiny gap, but I had to step away from it. I kept messing with it, and that glue doesn't dry like immediately. It takes a few seconds. So I did do some sanding with that orange is coarse and the gray is a fine sanding, sort of a foam backing. That's 3M product, extra fine. So you can use that on clay for any areas. But for right now, what the objective is try to fill in all those cracks or any place that there's an indentation, whether it's a crack or a mistake or whatever. You can use the paste to do that. And the epoxy that I'm using it's just a basic 2-part epoxy you can find on Amazon. You can find it at Michael's. It's not like the best or anything. In fact, I'll tell you now, I've had problems with the eyes. If you remember, we had cast the eyes using this, and then I painted them, and I put more epoxy on top of them. But for some reason, it had a whole bunch of bubbles in it. So epoxy can go bad, and I have had this for over a year, because I know I made Christmas stuff with it last year for the church. And I decided to go get some more epoxy at Michael's yesterday and recast it, and that had bubbles in it. So I don't know what's going on. I'm on my third casting of eyeballs and my third type of epoxy. So hopefully by the time I get to that part of the series, I'll have some eyes to put in this poor guy. All right, so I'm putting the ground up clay into the mixed up epoxy. That epoxy mix is 1-to-1, so it's pretty easy to do. Only problem with it, it takes 24 hours for it to cure, and that led to some issues. So I'm trying to make, pretty thick mixture here because the epoxy itself is pretty runny. It's like syrup, basically, that consistency. So you see a hole like this, you've got to put a whole bunch of this on there to fill in that crack. And you can see it's kind of grainy looking. And epoxy tends to settle, like it's going to self-level. So one of the issues with the size of those grains is that they stuck out when the epoxy settled. Also, because the epoxy takes a while to set, the size of these grains didn't really make it like a putty in the sense that it didn't run. So I had some areas that ran and dripped out and caused drips. So, like I said, this was kind of a nightmare. This took so long to try to get this piece back to where there was a smooth surface that we could use to do our mold. I mean, that's the goal here. If you're going to have a whole bunch of rough edges, it's not going to look good. It's not going to make a good mold. So we've got to get all these places where he broke to where they're smooth, and even though you might be able to see there's something there, you can't feel it. Like if you ran your finger over it, it should be smooth. All right? Now, at this point, what I'm doing, I had this bright idea that I would put a coat of epoxy on the nails because I'm aware that these little pieces are hard to get out of molds. So I thought, we'll make it nice and smooth, and that will make it easier to get out of the mold. Well, for one reason or another, that didn't really happen. That didn't really make them that smooth. And anyway, I don't suggest it. I don't think it really helped in any way. Maybe even made it worse. I don't know. Who knows? But probably wouldn't put the toenails on again anyway. That's just caused too many problems. All right, right there I'm filling in that crack. There was a little tiny crack where I, made that new piece for the toe. So I'm trying to get that smooth. Everything that I didn't like about how this project turned out is because of where I dropped it. Pretty much. There are a couple other things I would have done different, and I'll tell you as we go along. But it's a learning process for me, and from that aspect, I feel like, the whole project is a success because I learned so much about silicone and about molding, how to repair things. Yeah. So as I'm working on this, I'm kind of aware of the grittiness of the texture of that polymer clay that I graded, and I'm not really happy with how it's working, but I figure, this is what I've got. we're going to have to just grin and bear it. And, I knew I could sand it after it cured. So I'm thinking, well, if it just will fill in the crack, if the top of the surface is not exactly smooth, I can sand it. And that would be true if it hadn't, run out in some areas and caused drips. And the fact that some of the areas where I put it to fill in a deep crevice, it sank down into that as the epoxy cured and ran out. So I didn't have a built-up surface. I had, just a more smooth indention, I guess is the way to look at it. So as I'm doing this, I'm kind of thinking all along, like, well, it doesn't really look the way I would like it to look, but, maybe it's going to work. But by doing this part, I learned how to do a better powder situation. So I'll tell you about that. But you can kind of see where I'm putting it on. There's little chunks that sort of stick up. It's like big pieces of sand, that kind of texture. Because the grater it couldn't get it to a powder, which is what you really need. And because it's not like a powder, it's not really creating the paste that you want. All right, here it is after it's cured, and this is a day later, and I can see where the epoxy ran out and where it sank in, and it's just rough texture really all over. Some of the areas I had to carve off, like if that was a drip that came out, I had to carve that off with the X-Acto, or just started sanding and sanding and sanding using these little, I think these are also for nails. They're like a coarse sanding sponge. And it was when I got out my little electric sander, and this is really a nail tool also. It's not a Dremel. It doesn't rotate. The head doesn't rotate. It sort of vibrates. But I use this a lot when I'm carving my blythes, if I'm doing a part where I really need to go deeper, not a fine sand. This is like you're really trying to indent something or carve out something. So I got the sanding head, and see, that's the old particles. They're really chunky. So while I was using this on the Baby Yoda to sand down some areas that were sticking out that I wanted to sand out quickly, I realized I'm making like this really fine powder and it's going everywhere. So I'm like, powder, that's what I need. Duh, the light bulb went off. So then I started sanding down that little chunk of baked clay that I have to make a finer powder to go into the epoxy. So this is the way to do it. You don't have to have this tool, but you could use sandpaper, you could use a really fine file, even like a nail file. And these little electric sander tool things for nails are cheap. They're really cheap. I think I got it on Wish or AliExpress or something for like $17, and it came with like 100 different heads, grinding heads or something. Anyway, it's great for the doll work because it's not as aggressive as a Dremel. So you're not as likely to chew into your doll face if you're grinding it. All right, so we're going to go revisit this putty issue here. We're gonna mix up our epoxy again. We're going to use this finer powder-like stuff that we sanded as opposed to the grainy stuff. And I can tell you right now that worked much better. First of all, you're able to get it to a true putty consistency where it's not really going to run out like the others did. It really truly is kind of mixed into the epoxy to make it thicker, instead of just being particles within the epoxy that the epoxy can run around and escape. So I actually had to end up going off camera to grind more because this wasn't thick enough, but didn't want to bore you with that part. You can see there, that's really runny. It's just running right down the side. So if you put that in a crack or an area that you're trying to fill in, it's just going to run out as it cures over the next 24 hours. So the magic of editing, I got more ground, and now you can see it truly is like a putty type consistency. And this is what you really, really want. So if you have to fix anything with clay, this is the way to do it. Don't use your kitchen grinder. And if you do use your kitchen grinder, wash it really well afterwards, because this polymer clay can not be good for you to eat. So this was step 2. I had to go back into all the areas that sank down or didn't fill or whatever with the first attempt because of the size of the particles, and fill in with this better putty epoxy. And that's really all the rest of this is filling in all those places. No special way to do it. Just, you could use stick, you can use a paintbrush, to dab it on or whatever. And just make sure you get it in all the cracks and get it built up. Because like I said, if it's built up too much, you can always sand it down after it cures. But if it's still sunk in, then you're still going to have a problem, because you don't want that to be molded. You want it to be smooth. And that's one way to tell, is just to feel it. If you can run your finger over and it's smooth, doesn't matter if it looks like it's still cracked, it's okay. So that's pretty much it for this. I think I already talked to you about the head and how I put that back on in the previous video. This did pretty much work, although I had to do a whole lot of sanding and grinding to get everything smooth, and was able to at least save this piece and not have to make a whole nother one. And for that reason, I'm glad I did it. I'm glad that I could show you this. Maybe you already know it, but if you do break something and you feel tragic about it, like I did when I dropped this thing, you know that there's ways that you can repair it and make it better, and you don't have to feel like you wasted your time. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up. That always helps. And as always, I hope you subscribe, because we got lots more coming, and I don't want you to miss a thing. Thanks, and bye.